Hello and welcome to the Starting Sister series, the series where we go from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list and everything in between for the Sisters of Battle, also known as the Adepta Sororitas. In this video we'll be taking a look at some of the special rules that the Sisters of Battle have that make them rather unique and give them a lot of spice to how they play. And while many armies have unique rules that make them stand out on their own, the Sisters of Battle probably have the most variety of rules that make them one of the more complicated armies in terms of understanding how all the rules interact and how they play. That being said, let's take a look at one of these special rules, and probably the one that's one of the most interesting and makes the Sisters of Battle such an attractive army to play. That rule being the Acts of Faith, and the Acts of Faith is one of those rules that feels like you're cheating when you use it properly. And to begin with, the only way you can gain access to Acts of Faith is if your entire army is a Sororitas army being drawn from the Sisters of Battle Codex. This means if you want access to this ability, you can't include other factions within your army. Though that being said, some units do not have access to Acts of Faith within the Sisters army, and as such, there are going to be situations where you can still make a bit of a mixed army and include other factions while including certain units from the Sisters of Battle, such as the Mortifiers, which do not have Acts of Faith but are rather powerful units. So what does Acts of Faith do? To begin understanding the special ability, we first have to understand what a miracle die is. And what a miracle dice is a d6 that you roll when you meet a specific condition, and then you take that result and add it to a pool of miracle dice that you can later use in order to substitute for other rolls, meaning that you literally get to pick what your roll is going to be if you have that roll available within your dice pool. Thus, if you have enough miracle dice available, you can pretty much rig your most important rolls, and that is something that no other army can really do with such consistency as the Sisters of Battle can. Though do keep in mind that the miracle dice are rather limited in scope as they're consumed once they're used, meaning that you have to keep generating them in order to keep substituting them, and there are other limitations that we'll be looking at shortly. So how do you gain miracle dice? Well, there are different ways of gaining miracle dice, and many of those ways are from special characters and special rules. However, there's a set number of standard ways of gaining miracle dice, and without considering things like holy orders, warlord traits, and different artifacts or characters, the primary ways to gain miracle dice for any Sororitas army is that all Sororitas armies gain one miracle die at the start of each battle round. And after that miracle dice, there's one other way to gain a miracle dice, being that within any phase, if you've met one of the following conditions, you gain one miracle dice at the end of that phase. The first of those conditions is that a Sororitas unit has destroyed at least one enemy unit. This means that you want to be destroying a unit in every single phase you can possibly destroy a unit within, thus gaining the most miracle dice. So remember, if you can hold off on destroying a unit if you've already destroyed one, then you may want to do so that you can destroy it in the following phase so that you can better gain that miracle dice. But at the same time, don't hamper yourself by allowing enemies to live that you can easily destroy simply because you're being greedy with those miracle dice. So it's definitely a matter of understanding what your capabilities are when it comes to such things. That being said, this means that the Sisters of Battle do benefit from metas where the MSU is very popular or game states where MSU is common. And for those who might not be familiar, MSU stands for many small units. Though at the same time, the Sisters of Battle are a little bit harmed by Tide style armies that utilize large units or hard to destroy units, making it harder for you to generate those miracle dice. As such, 20-man units of Skitarii within the AdMech, or 20-man Necron units, or even armies like the Orcs with their large units can be a bit of a threat. However, Sisters can oftentimes deal with 20-man units of such relatively fragile units with many different options that they have within their army, so it's important to consider both fighting durable units as well as large and swarm type units for this ability. Additionally, the other condition that can be met in order to gain one miracle die at the end of the phase is if any Sororitas character is destroyed within that phase, so don't forget to take those miracle dice into account. Now once you've gained those miracle dice, you roll that d6 and you record the results within your miracle dice pool. It's good to have a set of dice set aside in a place where they cannot be hampered, or at the very least to write them on a piece of paper so there's no contention whether or not you've used that result, and you can cross it out or erase it once it's used. Now in order to use these miracle dice, you have to perform an act of faith, and to do so once per phase, one unit from your army can perform an act of faith using those miracle dice, and that unit must have the act of faith ability in order to do so. Now keep in mind that there are ways to get around this restriction by using things like the Simulacrum Imperialis to get extra uses of the miracle dice within a single phase and other such abilities. Though remember, you are still limited by your miracle dice pool, because once you've substituted one of your miracle dice results, that miracle dice is gone, you can no longer use it to substitute other rolls. And for those substitutions, you cannot substitute any rolls, but you are limited to the following rolls which you can substitute, being the advance roll, the charge roll, the hit roll, the wound roll, the saving throw, the damage roll, and morale tests. And when any of these dice are substituted, they do not count as being modified dice, but rather they count as whatever the result being substituted is, meaning that if you substitute a 6, it is considered an unmodified 6 for triggering certain other special abilities if certain special abilities apply to that specific roll. More so if dice are substituted with miracle dice, they cannot be rerolled. However, if only a part of the dice are substituted within a specific roll, for example the charge roll using 2 dice, and then a reroll happens, you'd only reroll the die that was not substituted, meaning you can get a little more mileage out of your substitutions in situations where you reroll a dice after a substitution has occurred for whatever reason. This all makes miracle dice incredibly powerful, as it allows you to automatically trigger results that require unmodified rolls of 6 or other such results. More so if you have a lot of high rolls within your miracle dice pool, you can use those results in order to substitute a charge roll and allow yourself to automatically pass charges at long ranges, meaning that your melee units are that much more of a threat because all of a sudden they can automatically pass those 12-inch charges that other armies would not be able to make as consistently as you can. And don't be afraid of medium to low rolls, because you can always find uses for those results as well, as low rolls are great for passing morale tests, and those medium rolls can still be used in different ways, such as adding up for different hit rolls or making charges that are medium range that are important to make and could still be failed in the situation of poor rolls. And they can even be consumed for other abilities that want to consume miracle dice without using the results in order to give you some other type of benefit. As such, the Miracle Dice make the Sisters Battle one of the most consistent armies out there in comparison to many other factions that can be very consistent, and I hope this explains why I said it feels like cheating when you use these, because at the end of the day, you're essentially legally rigging your rolls. Though do keep in mind, there are serious limitations in terms of how you can use these dice, because you do have to generate them before you can use them, and there are only certain things that you can substitute. So it's not as simple as constantly using them, because you can easily find that you've ran out of Miracle Dice at a most critical juncture, and you simply don't have enough when you really need them. So as you play the Sisters Battle, please do keep in mind how you use your Miracle Dice, and always aim to improve your usage, because proper usage of Miracle Dice is the difference between winning and losing a game. Now, while the Acts of Faith might be the most interesting of the Sister special abilities that tend to be more army-wide, I do think they have plenty of other special abilities that are very interesting, such as the Shield of Faith ability, which is a little bit more simple but still rather powerful. And what the Shield of Faith ability is that any unit that has Shield of Faith has a 6+ invulnerable save, and there are many different ways of modifying the save. However, do keep in mind that most of these ways specifically state that it cannot be taken beyond a 4+ invulnerable save when modifying it. And do remember that many of the Sororitas units actually have Shields of Faith, so a lot more of your army may have an invulnerable save than you first expect, making them a little more durable than many expect them to be. Although do keep in mind, with their low toughness in many cases, the Sisters are not as tanky as many other armies that might have similar types of saves, as even with an invulnerable save, it's still very possible to force through enough damage that you overwhelm the save potential of such things. Now the Shield of Faith adds one other ability to any unit that has the Shield of Faith ability, that being that the unit can attempt to deny the Witch as if they were a Psyker when an enemy Psyker attempts to manifest a power. But instead of rolling 2d6 like normal, you only roll a single d6, and you either deny the psychic power normally, or an unmodified 6 automatically denies the manifestation of that power. Do note very carefully that this roll cannot be substituted using Miracle Dice, so you cannot automatically change it to a 6 when trying to deny a Psyker. However, there are many different ways of modifying this roll within the army, so don't be afraid, because while the Sisters may not have Psykers, they do have many units with this ability, and they are very able to use this ability to deny quite a good amount of psychic powers, making them an army that does rather well against Psykers, with their ability to interact with them without having any. After the Shield of Faith ability, we have the Sacred Rites ability, and the Sacred Rites are an ability many Sororitas units have, and most if not all units that have Acts of Faith and Shield of Faith will have access to the Sacred Rites. And the Sacred Rites are a general buff ability that are selected once the mission is determined, so you do have flexibility with these, as you can see what the mission is and what your opponent is playing before selecting a Sacred Rite, giving you a lot of flexibility in terms of which Sacred Rite you select, as some of the Sacred Rites are rather specific in their application. When selecting a Sacred Rite, you can pick one of the Sacred Rites, or you can roll to generate 2 random options using a d6. And while there may be some corner cases where getting 2 at random makes sense, if you want 2 of these Sacred Rites, there are many ways of getting 2 Sacred Rites without having to randomly generate them, such as Holy Orders, Hymns, and other such abilities, so you should only randomly generate them if you're at a complete loss at which you should pick, but in most cases it'll be rather obvious in terms of which ones you should choose for your army, and there really shouldn't be a situation where you're randomly generating these, because if you really want access to 2 of them, there are many different ways of obtaining such access. Now let's take a look at the Sacred Rites in no specific order, but rather how they're featured 1 through 6 within the Codex. The first of the Sacred Rites is the Hand of the Emperor, and what the Hand of the Emperor does is it adds 1 to the advance and charge rolls of units with the Sacred Rite. This is actually incredibly good, and in most other armies you have to go into a specific subfaction in order to gain an ability such as this, so being able to have this as a generic ability that you can give to many different units within your army is an incredibly powerful option that is very hard to pass up and is pretty much a must-take for melee armies, as it adds to advance and charge rolls, and a melee unit that fails its charge roll automatically misses all of its attacks for that round of combat, as it has failed to reach engagement range of an enemy. And even though you have access to miracle dice and other potential ways of modifying your charge roll, it's still rather nice to have this extra benefit when you've already used up the miracle dice for the phase, or simply because you don't want to use up miracle dice or other abilities when considering a specific charge roll. The second Sacred Rite is called Spirit of the Martyr, and what this does is when an enemy destroys a model in melee with this rite, you roll a d6 for every model that is destroyed, and on a 6, the enemy suffers 1 mortal wound after they have finished attacking. An enemy unit can only suffer a maximum of 6 mortal wounds as a result of this, and this does not work on models that explode. It's definitely a cute ability, but it's a bit too cute, and I think in many cases there are just better things you can choose, although it's not the worst ability you can have, especially if you find that you end up with 2 Sacred Rites within a given turn. Third on the list of Sacred Rites is the Aegis of the Emperor, and what this does is when you use the Shield of Faith ability to deny a Psyker, you automatically die on both a 5+ as well as a 6. Against Psyker heavy armies, this can be great, and with Grey Knights as well as Thousand Suns coming out, this is a good option to have, and one that can definitely be a great choice in specific situations, while in others, this does absolutely nothing. And the fourth Sacred Rite is called Divine Guidance, and what Divine Guidance does is an unmodified roll of 6 to hit with range attack gains 1 armor penetration. It's a fine enough marginal ability that's okay for armies that can put out a good amount of volume when it comes to shooting, especially weapons that have a low or no armor penetration, allowing them to get that little extra bit when attacking enemies. That being said, unless you're getting this as an extra or your army's built to take advantage of this to some extent, it's not the best ability to choose, and you'll probably pick other options before you pick this one. The fifth Sacred Rite is the Passion, which says an unmodified 6 to hit in melee scores an additional hit. This is another one that's incredibly good with melee units, especially with armies that have a high volume of melee attacks. This goes great with the Hand of the Emperor Sacred Rite, as the combination of the two can take some of your melee units and make them all the scarier, so there are definitely going to be situations where you have a combination of 2 of these different Sacred Rites that affect melee combat and give you quite a lot of mileage when using a melee-based army, which the Sisters can do rather well as they have a lot of great melee choices. That being said, something like the Passion is much better on units with actually strong melee attacks as opposed to weaker ones that may have more melee attacks, because when you make 6 melee attacks, on average you only score 1 additional hit, meaning that you want that 1 additional hit to really matter when it goes through. Finally, last Sacred Rite being the Light of the Emperor in 6th place is one that says units with the Sacred Rite ignore leadership and attrition test modifiers. And like I've said in many of my other videos, I still don't really care about leadership modifiers, and maybe one day modifiers to your leadership will matter much more, but today is just not that day, and I'd rather have some of the other abilities available through Sacred Rites than this one in almost every single case. And to conclude the Sacred Rites, I think they're a nice set of perks to have, with a few of them being absolutely great, while the others are rather bad or situationally useless, while in other situations they can be rather good. The Hand of the Emperor is probably one of the better ones, but others can definitely contend with it, and being able to pick 2 with something like a Holy Order can be a valid option as well. Although on the other hand, randomly generating them is a rather risky prospect, and in most cases, as I mentioned, you should probably avoid randomly generating these unless you just want to have a bit of fun and really don't care what you get. Now, one last set of abilities I would like to cover before we conclude this video is the Hymns of Battle, which are a bit of a new thing within the 9th edition. And whereas before the priests automatically gave hymn buffs that were rather limited in scope, now more units have access to them but need to make a roll to enable them, and you cannot generally have multiple models using the same hymn. However, there are a lot more options to choose from that make them a lot more versatile than the old war hymns. Normally when you want to use a hymn now, you need to make it inspiring by choosing a hymn the model knows that hasn't been used yet by another friendly model, and you roll a d6, and on a 3+ you activate the selected hymn. So while you can fail the roll 2/3 of the time, you'll be successful and you'll unlock the hymn of battle that you wanted to use in order to gain the effects of that hymn. All models that have access to the Hymns of Battle know the War Hymn ability, which was the old school preacher and missionary buff in a sense that now lets you select a friendly Ministorum, core, character, or engine of redemption unit within 6 inches of the model using the hymn, and give models within that unit +1 attack. Solid as always, but it does feel a tiny bit nerfed, considering you can only have 1 instance of this, and it only affects a specifically selected unit, while at the same time you have to roll for it. That being said, with the overall changes to the hymns, they're probably comparable or slightly better than they were before as a whole. In addition to the war hymn, the models that typically know hymns of battle know an additional hymn which they select from a list of 6 different hymns if they are a pure sororitas model like the Dogmata. However, on the other hand, if they're a cult imperialis model such as the preacher or missionary, they are limited to selecting from 3 of those 6 different abilities. This has to be selected when building your army, so they are not as flexible as something like the Sacred Rites are. In no real order, let's take a look at the different hymns that you have access to within 9th edition. More so, the first 3 of these hymns anyone can use, including Cult Imperialis, and then the following 3 hymns after that will be for pure sororitas models only. Like the war hymn, these only take effect if you've passed the inspiring roll. The first of these war hymns is called Refrain of Blazing Piety, and when you inspire this hymn, an enemy unit within 12 inches suffers D3 mortal wounds, or it automatically suffers 3 mortal wounds if it is a chaos unit. This is a fair enough hymn, but it is somewhat limited due to the range and the fact that it generates a random number of mortal wounds, as well as having to be inspired to begin with. Overall, some of the other buff abilities are going to be better than this one, though I can see it being used at some point, especially if you have several different characters carrying hymns, as mortal wound generation is never a bad thing to have access to. The second hymn all priest models have access to is the Chorus of Spiritual Fortitude, and what this says is you can select a friendly Ministorum Core character or Engine of Redemption unit within 6 inches of the model using this hymn, and negate all enemy psyker abilities affecting that unit and prevent them from being affected until your next command phase. While this can be strong, it also doesn't do anything against certain armies, and seeing as you have to pick it up when building your army, it's only going to be good if you have multiple other hymn providers and want some tech choices against specific armies, or you're playing in an incredibly warped meta that's incredibly heavily dominated by psychers that want to cast negative modifiers onto your units. That being said, even then, you have so many ways of denying psychic powers that this feels like a bit of a missed opportunity to do something a lot more interesting. The third battle hymn is the Psalm of Righteous Smiting, and what this war hymn does is that the bearer becomes inspired and gains +1 strength to their attacks, +1 armor penetration to their melee weapons, and can fight again at the end of the fight phase. This is a cool ability with a lot of flavor and all of that stuff, but do remember, those who sing songs aren't usually the best fighters to begin with, although if you have plenty of hymn singers, this can be a little bit of fun, and something like the Dogmata can definitely make use of it considering she has a rather reasonable melee profile, although even then, remember, it's better to benefit quite a lot of models than an individual model in most cases. Now the following 3 hymns are limited to pure sororitas models and cannot be taken on cult imperialis models. The first of the second set of 3 hymns is the Litany of Enduring Faith, and what this does is when it becomes inspired, a friendly Ministorum core or character unit within 6 inches of the model using this hymn gains +1 to their invulnerable save to a maximum of a 4+ invulnerable save. It's a little bit of a sketchy ability, but it can be a valid choice in some builds probably, although you can gain this type of modifier much more easily from other sources than this hymn option, and in many cases you'll have better hymn options that give you a little more output than this will give you in terms of survivability. The second hymn of these 3 hymns is the Verse of Holy Piety, and this hymn allows you to select a friendly Ministorum core or character unit within 6 inches of the model using this hymn, and that unit gains the benefit of a sacred rite that isn't active, in addition to the one already active on that unit. This has some interesting play, and if you didn't have the flexibility of selecting rites when you already knew what your opponent was playing, this would have been a much stronger ability, though as it stands, it's a fun way to double up on niche rites against enemies without locking yourself into an order to benefit from 2 different hymns, but it does have its constraints as you can only help one unit with this ability, meaning that it's a bit limited in terms of how much mileage you can get from that additional sacred rite, although there are going to be situations where it is very useful. Finally, the last of the hymns of battle is the Catechism of Repugnance, and what this does is that you select a friendly Ministorum core or character unit within 6 inches of the model using this, just like the other 2 hymns within this list, and range attacks from bolt weapons within that unit gain the following 2 benefits. The first is that an unmodified roll of 6 to hit automatically wounds the target that they're shooting, and those shooting attacks gain 1 armor penetration within half range. Out of the different hymns of battle that are currently seeing play, this is probably the most popular of the choices, and considering how many bolt weapons you have now within the Sisters of Battle, especially with Artificer Stormbolters on dominions that have a large amount of shots with a medium strength and no armor penetration, this is rather strong and can contest the war hymn in many ways in terms of how powerful it is. Outside of certain corner cases, I'd go with this over most other choices, as it can benefit the most number of other models with the most amount of consistency and benefit when you're considering hymns of battle, especially when you consider that any model that is able to use this already knows the war hymn that is the other hymn of battle that is the most consistent. As all, I think the hymns of battle are a rather interesting idea, and I do look forward to seeing how they play out as time goes on, because there are quite a lot of different things you can do with them. And in addition to that, quite a few models have access to hymns of battle now instead of just the preacher and missionary like before. meaning you have quite a lot of powerful options in which you can bring hymns of battle, although at this time it doesn't seem like they're being taken en masse, but rather only 1 or 2 characters are taken with hymns of battle, which does make sense because remember, you're limited to using each hymn once a turn, meaning that once you've used one of your hymns, you have to use a different one on a different character. Although that being said, I definitely think there are a few really good hymns, and some of the characters that can carry hymns are actually rather powerful, and I can see a world where more than a couple characters show up carrying different hymns. So join me next time when we continue looking at the Sisters of Battle by taking a look at their different holy orders and seeing how those different holy orders play and how they affect building your army. And as always, if you've enjoyed the content, like and subscribe as it really does help the channel out. And if you get the opportunity, please do share the channel as that not only massively helps the channel, but also helps the people who may discover it and benefit from the content. I would also like to give a quick shout out to my patrons. You guys are awesome people. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. And regardless if you're a patron or not, thank you for watching and have a great day. See you next time. Bye.